CNN has learned that about 1,000 additional Customs and Border Protection agents are set to deploy to Minneapolis.
Federal agents have just announced a major drug raid, a drug raid with dozens of arrests. Investigators say this drug trafficking ring was so huge it was making millions of dollars every month. At 4:18 a.m., Minneapolis was still asleep. The streets were silent. Porch lights glowed faintly. Not a single movement, the kind of silence people pass through without noticing, in the final minutes before dawn. Then everything changed. Unmarked federal vehicles entered the neighborhood from 3 different directions. No sirens, no flashing lights, only controlled movement. Engines running low, doors opening in unison. More than 60 federal agents from the FBI and ICE moved into position within seconds. This was not a routine visit. This was a high-level coordinated federal operation. The target sat at the center of the neighborhood. A private residence valued at over $4.6 million, registered under the name Ayan Nur Hassan, the current Somali mayor of the city, the most recognized public figure in the area. A government official who had spent years speaking about accountability, public safety, and trust. At 4:21 a.m., the order was given. The front door was breached. Agents moved with precision. Room by room, floor by floor, the entire structure was secured in under 2 minutes. No resistance, no alarms, no warnings. Inside the master bedroom, the mayor was taken into custody. No statement, no questions, only silence. One agent later described the moment as controlled but deeply unsettling. Because this was not just an arrest. By 4:29 a.m., the location had been declared an active federal crime scene. Additional teams began arriving. Forensic units, cybersecurity analysts, financial investigators. Within the first 15 minutes, more than 12 sealed evidence containers were brought inside. Cocaine, high purity, compressed, packaged, measured in standardized units. Initial estimates placed the total weight at over 900 kilo, enough to produce millions of potentially lethal doses. But the drugs were only part of the discovery. Inside a closet in a guest bedroom, agents recovered $22.44 million in cash bundled in stacks of $10,000, each marked with dates and route identification codes. And that alone raised a question no one could ignore. What could possibly be stored inside a mayor's home that required this level of protection? Because at that moment, federal authorities were no longer treating this as a single case. They were preparing for something far larger. Here in Minnesota, meth is king. We are really swamped with meth right now. Federal and local authorities have teamed up on a major drug trafficking bust tied to a violent crime at a troubled Minneapolis corner. What began as a controlled arrest had now evolved into something far more complex. By 4:40 a.m., the house was no longer considered a private residence. It had become a forensic investigation site. Every room was examined and documented. Every surface was photographed. Every structural detail was inspected with precision. No detail was overlooked. Walls were scanned for density irregularities. Floorboards were checked. Ventilation systems were inspected. What the agents were searching for was no longer just evidence. They were searching for design. At 5:55 a.m., the first inventory report was confirmed. More than 1.2 tons of package material had been cataloged, individually sealed, uniformly labeled. Each unit weighed and marked with identification codes. Preliminary field tests confirmed the presence of cocaine and fentanyl, both at unusually high levels of purity. But volume was not the only immediate concern. The issue was structure. These were not random shipments. This was inventory arranged with intent, tracked, measured, and positioned according to a plan. Minutes later, investigators uncovered the most critical lead of the morning. A secured locker system concealed behind a reinforced interior wall. Inside were multiple encrypted hard drives. Once powered on, federal cyber units began analysis immediately. Within minutes, they identified more than 18,000 encrypted communications spanning nearly 8 years. Messages, call transfers, movement schedules, every interaction timestamped, every entry categorized, everything coherent, everything structured. This was not a collection of conversations. It was a coordinated system. By 5:32 a.m., deeper examination revealed additional layers. Inside a secondary compartment, agents recovered 11 burner phones, each assigned to a separate communication channel. Alongside them, a digital interface displayed real-time transaction flows showing movement across multiple cities. At the same time, financial logs began to surface. Preliminary estimates indicated that more than $480 million in tracked transactions were directly linked to the data inside the room, all routed through structured channels, all recorded with precision. And then one detail emerged that changed the entire direction of the investigation. The timestamps, the operations were not random. They followed fixed intervals, weekly cycles, monthly distribution, quarterly adjustments. This was not storage. This was control. By the end of the first hour, one conclusion had become unavoidable. This residence was not used to hide illegal activity. It was used to manage it. And if this was what existed inside a single property, then the scale of what operated beyond it was no longer a question of possibility. The issue was reach. More about last week's federal raids in the Twin Cities. One of them in Minneapolis sparking protests when people mistakenly thought it was an ICE raid. Michelle Beck is live in Minneapolis unpacking what's become a huge story here. By 6 a.m., the focus of the operation began to shift. The drugs had confirmed the scale. The cash had confirmed the value, but investigators knew from experience that neither explained how a system like this could operate for years without disruption. The answer was in the data. Inside a highly secured federal command unit, cybersecurity analysts began processing the encrypted hard drives recovered from the residents. The expectation was simple. Contact lists, transactions, perhaps a few routing logs. What they found was entirely different. At 7:02 a.m., the first layer of encryption was broken. What appeared on the screen was not a list. It was a map, a structured digital framework connecting locations, timestamps, and movement patterns into a single operational system. Internally, analysts would later refer to it as the distribution grid. At the center of that network were more than 200 active transport routes, each linked to specific transfer points across multiple states. Boston was only one node. The network extended with precision. North to New York, west to Chicago, south to Miami. Every route was fully documented with exact departure times, arrival windows, and handoff locations. Nothing was random. Everything was calculated. Within the first hour of analysis, investigators identified more than 11,600 recorded shipments over a period of nearly 7 years. Every load tracked, every delay logged, every deviation flagged. This was not improvisation. This was logistics. Closer examination revealed a hierarchical structure. Local operators, regional coordinators, central oversight. Each layer functioned independently, yet all were connected through the same encrypted system and at the highest level a limited set of administrative access points. The entry originated from inside the mayor's residence. By 8:15 a.m., analysts confirmed that the system had real-time adaptive capability. Routes could be altered within minutes. Shipments redirected. Entire transit segments paused or accelerated based on conditions on the ground. This was not a static operation. It was adaptive. More importantly, it was designed for resilience. If one route failed, another replaced it. If one location was compromised, the network shifted immediately. Resilient, controlled, scalable. By mid-morning, one conclusion had become unavoidable. This was not a hidden supply chain. This was a coordinated national distribution system operating in plain sight. And the residence raided just hours earlier was not merely connected to it. It helped run it. By 10:40 a.m., the investigation had moved beyond routes and shipments. The network had been mapped. The structure was clear, but the most critical question remained unanswered. Where had the money gone? Inside a highly secured federal facility, forensic accountants from multiple agencies began reconstructing the financial records recovered from the mayor's residence. The process was systematic. Every file was open. Every transaction was traced. Every account was cross-referenced. At first glance, the data appeared ordinary. Spreadsheets, invoices, property records, standard financial documents. But within minutes, patterns began to emerge. At 11:18 a.m., analysts identified the first cluster of linked entities. A group of companies registered under different names operating across different states, yet displaying identical transaction behavior. By 12:05 p.m., that cluster had expanded and it did not stop. Over the next several hours, investigators uncovered a network of more than 140 shell companies, each designed to appear legitimate on paper. Consulting firms, real estate groups, small investment companies. Most had no employees, no physical offices, no actual operations. Yet together they moved an enormous volume of money. By early afternoon, the total had reached $3.22 billion distributed across accounts, assets, and layered transactions over a period of approximately 7 years. This was not a single flow. It was a system. An estimated $1.1 billion had been routed through the real estate market. Residential homes, commercial buildings, apartment complexes quietly acquired, held briefly, then sold. Each transaction increasing the distance from the original source. Another $870 million had been processed through construction contracts for projects that did not exist. Permits were filed. Payments were approved. Invoices were recorded, but nothing was ever built. On paper, everything was complete. In reality, none of it was. The remaining funds were routed through nonprofit organizations and private trusts. Donations were fully documented. Tax filings were submitted. Public records reflected generosity and compliance. In reality, the origin of the money remained concealed. What stood out most was not just the scale. It was the precision. Every dollar had its own path. Every transfer carried a timestamp. Every account was positioned to support the next step in the chain. There were no gaps, no inconsistencies, no visible errors. One senior analyst described it simply. This was not money being hidden. This was money being managed. By 3:20 p.m., investigators confirmed that the financial structure had been designed for sustainability. If one company was disrupted, another would assume its function. If one account was frozen, multiple alternatives remained active. Redundancy was built into every layer. This was not a temporary operation. It was architecture. And then one final detail emerged, shifting the scope of the investigation. Once again, certain real estate approvals, contract authorizations, and legal permits tied to these transactions had been signed, reviewed, or influenced by offices connected to the mayor's administration. At first glance, there was no direct indication of illegal conduct, but the pattern remained consistent. Decisions that enabled movement, approvals that removed obstacles, timing too precise to ignore. By the end of the day, the conclusion was no longer theoretical. The money was not simply moving through the system. It was being directed through it. By 5:30 a.m. the following morning, the investigation entered its most decisive phase. What began as a single silent raid in Boston had now expanded into a coordinated multi-state federal operation. This was no longer an investigation. It was enforcement. Inside secured command centers, final authorizations were approved. Timelines were synchronized down to the minute. Teams were briefed with precision. This time there would be no delays, no procedural slowdowns, no internal interference. At 6 a.m., operations were executed simultaneously across 3 states. More than 900 federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and specialized financial task forces were deployed. Offices linked to the network were raided without warning. Front companies were secured. Records were seized immediately. No media presence, no public announcement, only controlled action. By mid-morning, authorities confirmed that 52 individuals had been taken into custody. The list did not include only low-level operators, city officials, legal advisors, financial intermediaries, individuals whose roles had allowed the system to function smoothly. But arrests were only part of the objective. At 10:15 a.m., federal authorities initiated asset seizures on a scale rarely seen in a municipal corruption case. Bank accounts were frozen. Real estate ownership was transferred to federal control. Business licenses were suspended. By the end of the first day of operations, more than $780 million in assets had been seized or frozen. An additional $430 million in active transactions had been flagged and halted across multiple financial institutions. For the first time in years, the flow of money slowed, then it stopped. What investigators confirmed next reshaped the case entirely. Internal reviews showed that certain administrative decisions made over the past 7 years had directly aligned with the needs of the network. Permits approved at critical moments, inspections delayed, funding allocations redirected. Individually, each action appeared procedural. Together, they formed a pattern, a system that did not resist the operation, a system that enabled it. By early afternoon, federal officials discussed the scope of these findings in a closed briefing. This network had not survived by avoiding attention. It had survived by operating within accepted procedures. That distinction was critical, because it meant the issue no longer existed only within criminal activity. It extended into governance itself. By 2:40 p.m., investigators confirmed that additional indictments were being prepared. More names were under review. More departments were under investigation. The operation was not over. It was expanding. One senior official summarized the situation without emphasis. When a network moves over $3 billion through legitimate channels without disruption, the system itself becomes part of the equation. By the end of the second day, Boston had changed. Not because of what had been found, but because of what had been revealed. For years, this network had operated in plain sight, not hidden from the system, but supported by it. And that left one unanswered question. It was no longer a matter of who had been involved. How many remained unseen?